It's very swampy, as you'll see. It's one of the big problems, or one of the reasons that mosquitoes were such a problem at that time. For much of the information, particularly about mosquitoes in Michigan early on, came from a very unlikely source, from a Frenchman who spent about a year in the United States and visited Michigan less than 2 weeks. Nevertheless, he wrote a book about his experience while he was visiting Michigan, and had some he commented a number of times about just how significant the mosquitoes were. Alexis de Tocqueville, and he is best known as the author of Democracy in America. He came to the United States in 1831 with the idea, he was sent to study the American prison system. He did much more than that during his time here, and he visited Michigan shortly after he arrived in the United States in July of 1831. So the account that he wrote of his time, his short visit to Michigan, was called 2 Weeks in the Wilderness. De Tocqueville had arrived to the United States into New York and spent the first few months of his time there in the city. And he wanted to venture out and actually experience the wilderness of the United States. He also wanted to see the Native Americans that were around at that time in more of a historical setting for them. He'd seen a lot of them in New York. New York was a large town at the time. And so he set off from New York and did this visit to Michigan, landed in Detroit, and from the 23rd to the 31st of July, 1831, he searched out and was able to experience Michigan, the Michigan of 1831. In the short book, really, it was not very long, mosquitoes were mentioned on 8 different occasions as to how troublesome they were during his visit. Also mentioned was forest fever, was not really known as malaria at the time. And the map here shows his journey from Detroit all the way up to Saginaw. And this map, by the way, is from a Clarke exhibit from just a couple years ago that when I started this research, I was fortunate enough to be able to visit while it was still on display, and got to speak with John Fierce, who was involved heavily with the development of this exhibit. And it was very helpful to me in my research too, and I'm very grateful to the assistance I've gotten from the Clarke Library. So that you understand what the settlements and what Michigan looked like at the time. Remember, this was before it was a state. It was a U.S. territory at the time. And these are the settlements throughout Michigan in 1830. And you can see that when de Tocqueville wanted to really get out and see the wilderness, that's exactly why he chose Saginaw as his final destination on his journey through Michigan. At the time of 1830 to 1831, Detroit had a population of about 2,500, and Saginaw was just a very small community of 30 individuals made up of about 5 or 6 homes. And de Tocqueville, to travel just to see things was really unusual at the time. So rather than, the way he described it, rather than have to explain that to a lot of different people, he went on the pretense and met with people that he was wanting to buy property. And he came across somebody in Pontiac who was probably hopeful that he could talk de Tocqueville into buying some local property in the Pontiac area. And when de Tocqueville mentioned that he was interested in seeing Saginaw, the individual, this American he was corresponding with, was very taken aback. And he said, "You wish to go to Saginaw? Saginaw Bay? You realize Saginaw is the furthest inhabited point before the Pacific Ocean?" Now, a little bit of a stretch, but if you see the map here, you can see Saginaw was quite remote. And between these two areas were swamps and very dense forest. So a little bit about the Saginaw area in particular. In 1819, with the Treaty of Saginaw, this portion of Michigan was added to US territory. And just a couple years later, a military outpost was established, Fort Saginaw, in 1822. And then just 1 year later, Fort Saginaw was abandoned, primarily due to malaria. And one of the officers at the time commented that nothing but Indians, muskrats, and bullfrogs could possibly subsist here. And just so you know a little bit about how much Saginaw was to change from this period, the time that de Tocqueville visited in 1831. So as I've said, 30 inhabitants in 1831. By 1850, that had grown to 2,600. And fast forward 34 more years, and the population of Saginaw was 76,000 people. This was due to the lumber industry and the lumber boom of the 19th century in Michigan. So Saginaw was in for big changes. And even de Tocqueville commented on how he saw that industry was coming and it was going to change things so profoundly. He was grateful he was able to see Michigan in the state that it was when he got there. So the Saginaw Trail, this is the way that they got through the state from Detroit to Pontiac, and then from Pontiac primarily up into Saginaw. They were able to find some Indian guides that helped them to get through the area. And Saginaw Trail was a walking path. It was used by Native Americans and others that were walking through the area. You could probably, much of the time, you could go through it on horseback, but there were so many trees that were fallen on the trail that you wouldn't have been able to take a wagon of any type. So that's how they traversed for a couple of days from Pontiac up to Saginaw. Things have changed, obviously, and this is the Saginaw Trail that we know today. A lot easier to get around. So now to get to the description that de Tocqueville included in 2 Weeks in the Wilderness, just to have a few quotes that show the impact of the mosquitoes on him. He called mosquitoes the scourge of the American wilderness. He said he'd never experienced torment similar to that he'd suffered from them, and especially during his stay in Saginaw. In another quote, when he'd gotten up to Saginaw, they went on a day excursion to hunt. He said he was forced to load his rifle on the run because it was so difficult to stay still for a single moment. And those of us who have experienced mosquitoes so bad that you can't stop moving during the day know that they were quite troublesome if they were so abundant that they were biting to that extent during the day, let alone at night when they're mostly active. And then that night following that day, he said, was one of the most difficult he'd ever spent in his life. The mosquitoes had become so irritating. It was impossible to close my eyes despite being overwhelmed by tiredness. So mosquitoes were definitely a big nuisance. Despite all of the beauty and all of the appreciation de Tocqueville had for Michigan and being able to finally see the open wilderness of America, they were quite impactful. Again, 8 different mentions in a very short account of his visit included how the impact that mosquitoes had on him. So there's 3 primary reasons I'll go into as to why the mosquitoes were as they were at that time in 1831. topography of Michigan, and particularly this area of Michigan that he visited, the wetlands of the time, and the extent of forest. So I'll go into each of these. So first off, on the topography. So this is on the left is a topographical map of Michigan. And you can see that the areas along the lakes are generally low relief, low-lying land. In the Saginaw Bay, this is particularly the case. It's a major watershed with many rivers that feed into this low-lying area. And to the right, I'll point out that at the end of the last ice age, as the glaciers were retreating to what are now the Great Lakes, actually Saginaw Bay, or the Saginaw Valley, and much of coastal Michigan, particularly on the east side of the state, was underwater. This was a lake before the Great Lakes receded to their current lake bottom boundaries. So very low-lying area. Before this was a lake area, the Saginaw Valley was covered with glaciers, and that settled the ground down and even caused it to be even more flat. In Midland County, the highest point, I think, is the landfill. And that's why we've got our job in this county, by the way. A lot of great habitat for mosquitoes. So topography, and that has not changed. These mosquito habitat areas that occur in this part of the state and throughout much of the areas along the Great Lakes still remain and produce a lot of mosquitoes even today. And okay, so topography is one aspect. The wetland situation historically in Michigan. So pre-settlement Michigan, in its original state, there was almost 11 million acres of wetland covering the state, or 17% of it. This map here is very interesting in what it shows here is, and I'm sorry for the color scheme. If you're red-green colorblind, you may not be able to notice this. All of the red areas here are historical wetlands that have been developed, that have been drained or filled in one way or the other. The green are the extant wetland areas that remain today. So you can see just how much, particularly the lower part of the lower peninsula, has changed with regard to the amount and extent of wetlands. All of that red area used to produce a lot of mosquitoes that utilize that habitat. Today, it's no longer available to them. It's been drained. So there's overall been about a 40% reduction, or 4.2 million fewer acres of wetland than there were historically at the time that de Tocqueville visited. And if you look at the county, the wetland loss per county, it's much more than 40% in some cases. And in particular, I highlight there are 4 counties in the state of Michigan that have a dedicated mosquito control abatement program. Bay County, Midland, Saginaw, Tuscola, all fall within the Saginaw Valley area because of that low topographical relief. And if you consider just how much wetland area there used to be, Bay County's been reduced by 84%. Midland County's been reduced the least amount by 51%. Saginaw and Tuscola counties, more than 80% of the historical wetlands have been drained and converted for other types of use. So that will help to explain exactly why the mosquitoes were as significant as they were historically. So a couple things that did establish Michigan's reputation in the 1800s. In the 1820s, Saginaw region was described as wet and swampy that could never be settled. And then a 1815 survey commissioned by the United States came back to say that the state was consisted of swamps, lakes, poor sandy soil, not even worth the cost to survey. So perhaps made a little bit of a delay in the settlement of Michigan because of these reports coming back about how the land was just not very suitable for much of anything. Again, contributed to a lot of mosquitoes. And so throughout the 1800s, there were various laws and commissions that were established to deal with the wetland areas. In 1839, just 2 years after Michigan was established as a state, was the first drainage law. A federal law in 1850 would have been used, the Federal Swamp Drain Act. In 1873, the Michigan State Board of Health was first established, and one of their big charters was drainage. Drainage because of the perceived health risks associated with malaria, or ague, as it was known at the time. And they attributed, the Michigan State Board of Health attributed a 75% reduction in malaria due to the drainage efforts. And it turned out that that probably is fairly accurate, because not because of the reason they thought. Malaria didn't come directly from swampy areas. It came from the mosquitoes that came from swampy areas. So it was a fortunate, it was fortunate that they did take out some of those drainage efforts for the sake of public health, because it did indirectly reduce the malaria cases. And then in 1898, the drain commissioners were established. So a lot of effort was put in during the 19th century to drainage of areas. And here's an article from Michigan Farmer magazine talking about, in the Saginaw area, how dredging and drainage of what they say is useless swamp into the best farm in the Saginaw Valley. So this land was very fertile, and that was the reason for a lot of the drainage, was to convert it to land that could be used for purposes at the time, such as agriculture. So topography and the extent of wetlands in Michigan, early Michigan. And then finally, the forests of Michigan. It would have been something to behold to see the forest that de Tocqueville saw. The left map shows the virgin forest in 1850, and then much of that forest in the upper part of the Lower Peninsula was white pine stands. And of course, these were the big push during the logging era, to use these for cutting for lumber. So there was extensive forests that, as I've already said, that de Tocqueville had to traverse to get from Pontiac in particular all the way up to Saginaw. And he had a really great description of the forests in 2 Weeks in the Wilderness. To try to describe and relay what it was like to experience these forests. In vain you climb the tallest tree, only to find yourself surrounded by others still taller. To no avail you climb the hills, for the forest climbs with you everywhere. And this same forest stretches from where you stand all the way to the North Pole and the Pacific Ocean. It must have felt that way, those many, many miles that they walked the Saginaw Trail, fortunate to have some Native Americans to help them to get through the area and know where the forks were, which way to actually take and get through there. But he just said it was, and the silence of the forest was just profound to him. He'd never experienced anything like this. He was from, there was no, I'm sure that there were very few forests in France that would compare to what he was experiencing in Michigan. So this is the overall history since the last ice age of the Michigan forests. So as the glaciers retreated from the last ice age, then the forest began to become established throughout the state, and then into the logging era. And there was no sustainable logging, no sustainable forestry at the time. It was take everything you can from the acreage and then keep moving. So you can see how much of the forests were removed and cut during this period. And we're actually in a rebound period ever since then. And things look much different in Michigan, and much better in a lot of ways than they would have 100 years ago here. Here's some pictures of the logging era and these giant white pines that were removed. And then on the top right, a shot of the landscape after they'd done their work and moved on. So that you know, if you've noticed, and why am I talking about forests and mosquitoes, and are they really tied? If you've been in the forest, and I'm sure most of us have, in the spring in particular in Michigan, you'll know that they hold a lot of water. There's a lot of wet areas that will, in March after the snow melts and the spring rains come, there's a lot of water throughout the woods. Mosquitoes, a number of mosquitoes take advantage of those sites for larval development. And so once they've dried up in May or June, they're fine. They've had enough time to develop, they're off, they're flying, and they're biting. So that is the third component of this, is, again, the topography of Michigan, particularly in the Saginaw Valley area, the extent of wetlands historically, and the extent of forest. All of these contributed to the mosquitoes and will help you to understand why de Tocqueville had such profound statements to make about how bad the mosquitoes were at the time. So this is the one slide I get to talk specifically about mosquitoes. So for the species, and this is just based on what I know occurs in our area, from the wetlands, these various species come. Anopheles quadromaculatus was and could be even today a malaria vector. That one still occurs here. It comes from wetland areas. And from the forests, all of these different mosquitoes. And given the time that de Tocqueville visited in July of 1831, my guess is everyone where you see his picture would have probably had a very healthy population and would have been a real burden at the time. So the vast majority of all those species coming from the wetlands and coming from the forest caused the scourge of the American wilderness, as de Tocqueville put it. So development in Michigan, we have gone largely, there was an extensive forest, extensive wetlands as has been described. A lot of those have been converted either to in one or two directions, either for agricultural use or for human development of some type. And though, you know, there's it would have been amazing to experience the forests of the 1830s. One thing that you can say about the land being converted for these purposes is you do, in fact, get fewer mosquitoes as a result. So one benefit, perhaps, of the land conversion in Michigan. So that wraps up there's two parts of this talk. The first part was the historical aspect of mosquitoes, and then the second is on specifically to a discussion of malaria. This is a map of the United States in 1870 showing the incidence of malaria. You can see it occurred throughout much of the United States, that are the U.S. of the time. Of course, it occurred down in Texas and Florida, but also throughout the Midwest and up into Michigan, as you can see. Malaria was estimated to cause between 50 to 75% of the infections among early Michigan settlers. As I've mentioned already, it wasn't known as malaria at the time. It was called ague or agar, and the cause was unknown. It wasn't until the latter part of the 19th century that we knew how malaria was spread. The name malaria is Italian for bad air, malaria, and it came probably from the Romans that experienced this, and that was the name of it. So you can see right in the name is cooked in the idea that this comes from poor quality air that you breathe in that makes you sick. The fact that people, the reference to get some fresh air is good for you. This refers back to the thought that malaria comes from rotting vegetation and poor quality air from swamps. So with regard to early Michigan and the sayings of involving malaria, don't go to Michigan. That land of ills, the word means ague, fever, and chills. And another is, and of every day, there was sure as day would break, their neighbor Agar came that way inviting them to shake. And also understand that when you got sick with malaria, it could be a long-term sickness. In this quote here, this individual says, "My father had it constantly for nearly 2.5 years." Also said that there were not well persons enough often to take care of the sick. Here's another account. "My father shook with the ague every day for 18 months. Crops went back into the ground. Animals suffered for food. And the pale, shallow, bloated faces of that period were the rule." De Tocqueville, De Tocqueville actually described what it was like because of the accounts that were given to him to actually settle in a particular area of Michigan at the time. Land was very cheap. You could buy an acre in Michigan for the equivalent of a day's wages. But the real trick was making something out of that land, carving out an existence for yourself once you'd obtained it. And the vast majority, that acre that you were to purchase, or however many acres you got, were entirely wooded, had to be cleared so that you could you could build a home, so that you could plant crops, so you had pasture land for animals, so that you could carve out an existence. And if you can imagine having to suffer for 2.5 years with a debilitating sickness, at the same time that you're trying to do all of this labor-intensive work, I have a lot of profound respect for the first pioneers of Michigan and just what they encountered to be able to come to this area and establish a life. And so you know how the infection of malaria that occurred here in Michigan was. There are a few different species of the protozoan that causes malaria. The one that occurred in malaria in Michigan was Plasmodium vivax. And it comes often in a very predictable cycle. You had your ague day. And the ague and the sickness, just so you understand how debilitating malaria was, you'd go through a period of chills. And then with that shivering, there was an account of one saying that they shook so hard that the dishes came off of the shelves. And then you go from that extreme to a fever, very significant fever. And as that fever is waning, profuse sweating. So this is your day. On your ague day, you go through a cycle of all 4 of these things. And then you'd get a reprieve. In most cases, you'd get a day off and you'd be able to get some work done. You'd be able to attend to things. So because of that cycle, well, first off, one would say, another common saying in Michigan at the time, have you had the ague yet? And if not, well, be assured that you will have it. Most people suffered from this disease at one time or another. And because of the regular bouts and the predictable bouts with Plasmodium vivax of fevers, chills, people's schedules and their professions were planned around this cycle. So the minister preached to accommodate his shakes. The justice of the peace scheduled the docket around his ague fits. Lawyers adjourned cases to avoid his ague day, and the housewife regulated her fears by it. So everybody, you can just think of this labor-intensive time where the work that you had to put in was essential in many cases, unless you had a profession, to feeding yourself and your family, and only being able to really function half of the time. Gives you an idea of just how significant malaria was in early Michigan. So what could early settlers do for relief? Well, there was one actual effective remedy, and that was quinine. It's a bark from a tree. It occurs in South America. And one of the quotes with regard to quinine was that it meant more than bread at the time because of how severe malaria was. And not yet linked yet what was done about mosquitoes at the time, because mosquitoes were quite significant. Smudges. Smudges were smoldering fires. There were just a few things you could do. Create these fires with wood that was wet often to create a lot of smoke. Mosquitoes tended to pull back from that. I'm sure it wasn't pleasant for the people either, but it did provide some relief for people. There's accounts of farmers doing this for their livestock as well, so they get relief from the mosquitoes as well. So smudges, and quinine in the case of some relief from malaria. Now, there was a creative remedy in the accounts of the pioneers that I thought was worth mentioning. So it's a 4-step process. All right, first off, clip your toenails and your fingernails. Next step, wrap them in tissue paper. Bore a hole in a maple tree and plug the hole with the tissue paper. I didn't find any accounts of this being effective, but certainly it was the most unique of the approaches that I saw in the research that I did. So as I've said, the malaria mosquito, the one that was spreading malaria at this time in Michigan, Anopheles quadromaculatus, comes from wetland areas, comes from swamps. This mosquito is still present in Michigan and could potentially still be a transmitter of malaria. So why is malaria no longer a threat in Michigan? Well, one of the reasons has to do with reduction of wetland areas. We still do have this mosquito here. It's not as abundant as it would have been in the 1830s, 1850s. But here's the key. In order for a mosquito to get infected with malaria, it has to bite an infected human. So the mosquito cannot pick up the mosquito, or the mosquito cannot pick up the infection without somebody who has malaria for them to feed on. That's unlike West Nile virus, which is a problem today. West Nile virus cycles between birds and mosquitoes. It's in the environment. It cycles in this county throughout the majority of Michigan. And when a mosquito that's fed on an infected bird bites a human, that's how humans and horses get infected with West Nile virus. It's cycling already. It doesn't rely on a human to be infected first, like malaria. That's the number one reason. We've got better control of malaria in the United States now, so there's not the infected individuals, humans, for mosquitoes to feed on. And standards of living We're not exposed to mosquito bites like we used to be. Air conditioning, screening on windows. And speaking of screening on windows, I'm very excited to talk about this article. It was published in Michigan Medical News in 1880, and the title is Window Screens as a Prophylactic of Malarial Poisoning. 1880. 1880 was the year that the protozoan of malaria was first isolated from the blood of a malaria patient. So at that point, they said, okay, so that's what's causing the infection. They didn't know how it infected people. They didn't know how they contracted that virus or that protozoan. But that was just in 1880. So this article was published at that same year, and probably because it would have been written prior to this, I'm sure that this Dr. William Mall didn't even know the cause, perhaps didn't even know the cause at the time of the publishing of this paper. And furthermore, the cause of and the role of mosquitoes in malaria, in transmitting malaria, was still 17, 18 years from being elucidated. So in 1880, nobody knew for sure. And in fact, the consensus, conventional wisdom was still that malaria came from poor quality air, from rotting vegetation, from swamp areas. And so this doctor, who's a physician, William Mall, observed in this article that two families in a malarious area were free from infection. There were no other appreciable differences between these two families and the others, except that these two families that had avoided malaria infection had screens on their doors and windows, and the others had not. It was not common practice to have screens on your doors and windows at this time. It was many decades later before it was common practice. Despite the fact that the mosquitoes were so troublesome, it just wasn't a practice. It was probably very expensive to do. So think of this now. This doctor is looking at these two families not suffering from mosquito. The only difference he could tell between them and the others, sanitation was comparable in all cases, is that they had windows, or they had screens on their windows. And so he conjectures as to why, in the paradigm of the time, which was bad air, admitting again that malaria is a result of heat, moisture, and vegetative decomposition, is it any more unreasonable to believe that screens can prevent it from entering sleeping rooms? So he's trying to figure out what components in the air that cause malaria could be stopped by screens. And it's very interesting. So this is what I call a lost opportunity in history. It was laid out right there, this link of malaria and mosquitoes, with just a little bit more curiosity. Perhaps the Nobel Prize might have not gone to Sir Ronald Ross in 1898, as it did, but might have gone to Dr. William C. Mall of Illinois. And that is my discussion. Having talked and hopefully painted a good picture of just how bad the mosquitoes were and just how bad malaria was in early Michigan. I'm very grateful once again to John Fierst and the Clarke Library for allowing me to be able to share this talk. This is some of the source material that I got these accounts from. And thank you once again. And if there are any questions, then I would be glad to entertain those.
Carl, I've got one here that I've been looking at. Someone who thinks this is all fascinating and says, so what do I do to keep those little buggers off of me when I go in the woods? So as an expert on mosquitoes, what should they do?
Yeah, so it turns out that, you want to look for FDA approved repellents. So those active ingredients are, you'll find them, DEET is the most common one. There's also picaridin, there's IR 3535 is another active ingredient. These all will have the FDA approval. Sometimes it's so bad you want netting. We've got 17,000 acres in Midland County of state forest that we do not treat. And in the summertime, in May, you venture into those areas, just like the Tocqueville in the middle of the day, and it can be quite significant. So sometimes they're just abundant, and it's and you're just it seems like the smallest area of your skin that you fail to put any kind of repellent on, they're at you immediately. So they can be very troublesome still in this state, and definitely in the wooded areas in the spring. And that's what you can do to protect yourself if you've got to go into a heavily infested area. But it has been so bad before that I've put netting on over my head or whatever.
Wow.
I hope that answers it.
Okay. Question: can you tell us about mosquito control as it's done by the counties? Okay, what do you do all day?
Sure. Yeah. So we have a program, and we're the mosquito season's about 6 months here in Michigan. So from the period of you'll start seeing the mosquito larvae in the woods, as I've described, in March, and they'll begin their development, and they'll be off and flying and biting in May usually, and then they'll, depending on the weather patterns and the rainfalls that you get that can produce more mosquitoes throughout the season, you might have subsequent hatches of different species of mosquitoes throughout. So what we do a very large treatment of the county each year with aircraft. That's a time of the year where we get a very predictable hatch of mosquitoes, those spring species that come from the forested areas that I mentioned. So we'll cover in Midland County 58,000 acres of the county with aircraft, and a very fortunate insecticide. It's a biological that comes from a bacteria. It's very specific to mosquitoes. It doesn't harm the other organisms in the aquatic environment that we apply it. It's the ideal insecticide. Problem is you can't kill adults with it, but as many as the larvae that we can get to in the spring, we use that as our method of control of mosquitoes in the spring. And then we've got our trucks that'll go out in the night to fog to get them the adult mosquito stage. We do a lot of other types of foot crew treatment of standing water each time we get a heavy rain during the summer. So it's a whole mix of things, really. And 2/3, I'm glad to say, 2/3 of our treatment is in the larval stage, and it's with these highly specific biorational insecticides that are really good as an alternative to some of the material that used to be used many years ago when we'd had fewer choices.
Okay, I've got what might be a question about an urban legend. I once heard that there's a delay in their hatch. A wet year creates huge hatches the following year, not the year that's actually wet. Is that true?
It can be with particular types of mosquitoes. Yes. So depending on where this individual lives, those that live, say, in the coastal areas of Bay County, and where you'll have a lot of cattail and a lot of coastal habitat, there are species of mosquitoes that emerge from those permanent water habitats. And as the water table rises, if you have a particularly wet year the previous year, you create even more flooded areas, more abundance of habitat. You can have higher populations of that particular type of mosquito. Now, it's not across the board. So other types of mosquitoes are very dependent on what has happened that year and not the previous year. So it depends, but the cattail mosquito I'm talking about is one of the most abundant in the summertime, particularly in July. So if that's the time you're talking, and you're talking that species, yeah, that actually can be something.
Okay. Curiosity question. Have Native Americans developed significant immunity to malaria from their long residence and exposure?
I don't know for sure.
Okay.
My guess is that um, they that malaria was introduced with the Europeans, and whatever century, I'm not sure, maybe the 1600s, 1500s, maybe even earlier than that. What you do see at a population scale is Africans. Africans have a sickle cell trait that makes them, it can be a problem, but it also, the malaria protozoan has a hard time entering into the red blood cells of people with sickle cell trait. And so it's the idea is, although sickle cell trait can lead to anemia and some other problems, it probably was a reproductive advantage to people for many thousands of years who resided in malarious areas of Africa, and allowed them to survive perhaps when others didn't, in any particular type of malaria that is much more deadly, by the way, than the vivax malaria that I was describing in Michigan. So I don't know about Native Americans so much. The only thing I can point to is Africans that have been exposed to malaria probably more than any other people group.
Okay. You've talked about mosquito control. I've got a question. Do you do anything for ticks? Or is there a control program for ticks in Michigan?
Ticks are becoming an increasing problem. They're expanding throughout the state, primarily the western side of the state, but also we're seeing an increase over on the eastern side as well. They are bringing with them Lyme disease, and in our county, I think it's just a matter of time. We'll begin seeing more ticks. As of yet, we have not, and it is not part of our program. I would imagine that some of the public health districts throughout the state, maybe in the more southern or the western counties, carry out some types of tick control. Tick control is much more difficult than mosquito control, which is obviously good for me, but it is a real challenge, and to do a population approach and really make a dent in the numbers of ticks. But they're on the rise. With them, they're bringing diseases such as Lyme disease, and we can all expect over the coming decades that they'll be more abundant, and we may begin some type of tick control in the future at some point.
Okay, speaking about the future, I've got one other future-oriented question. It's a question about climate change and rising temperatures, and would that cause more cases of malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases?
In parts of the world, yes. I don't anticipate that we're going to see a whole lot more cases of malaria in particular. What we might see are other cases of arboviruses. So we might see more incidents of West Nile virus, some others that are less well known, like Jamestown Canyon and some of these others. It may change. I think we're definitely seeing some change in the distribution of species in North America and in Michigan as a result of changes in climate. So over time, yes, we're going to see some changes in distribution. There is one particular invasive mosquito species known as Aedes albopictus. It occurs throughout Ohio now. It's making its way into Michigan more and more so. And that's another one. It's a potential vector of some things such as dengue fever and chikungunya and even Zika virus. Not as effective as other mosquito species that can transmit those viruses, but that is something that particular one is one that we are on the lookout for, because we think it may be encroaching further and further into Michigan.
Okay, thank you. I've got no more questions, so unless somebody's going to send me something real quick here. And I'm looking at my screen to see if anything's popping in, but no one, I see nothing telling me someone's keying in. So, Carl, thank you. It was a fascinating talk. I enjoyed it. I've got a couple comments here, but various other people have enjoyed it. It was just great of you to take the time to speak with us this evening. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you for thinking of me when you put this together. It's been a very enjoyable. I really enjoyed speaking about this, and I think there's a broad interest in just understanding these historical aspects of Michigan and mosquitoes. So, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to end the meeting now. So I appreciate your being with us. And next week, we'll be talking to Miles Harvey about James Jesse Strang in the book he has just published, The King of Confidence. So thank you all and good night. Good night, everyone.